Well, as Mike said, I'm Ollie Wells. I'm a director here at Viranda. As you said, we focus predominantly on commercial property acquisition and the management. We do have some other offshoots in residential sort of areas and development. So we're quite a broad business, but yeah, my sort of take today is really around that the commercial property sector. Feel free if there are any points you want to jump in on and ask any questions. I know we'll leave Q&A to the end, but if there's anything particularly that I cover that's not understood or is a big question mark against it, please try and sort of speak up. I'm purposely going to keep it quite high level at this because yeah, there's quite a lot of areas to cover. But yeah, thanks for this opportunity, and we'll see where we get to. I guess, yeah, you mentioned you're taking a break from the COVID sort of discussions. Unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, we've got to kind of take that into account as we sit here today. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't. But you know, it certainly is interesting times for all of us in the property sector in general, not only in residential and commercial. But I guess as a brief overview, really, commercial property is split down, and forgive me if I'm being sort of slightly basic, split down into a number of different sectors. Many of them you'll be quite sort of averse and au fait with, being retail, offices, or industrial premises. And I guess what I personally enjoy about commercial property more so is that each sector does perform differently. It has different drivers, it has different catalysts, it just a number of different variables will go with it. And you know, we all focused on location when it comes to property, but one particular sector may work well in commercial sense, but in say a retail sector. But just because that works well doesn't mean an office property will work well in that same location. You know, they all have various different sort of a number of different variables and a number of different things to sort of take into account when you look at any commercial property investment. You know, it isn't a one size fits all sort of investment strategy. You know, what's suitable for one person could be very different for someone else. And that's where we've sort of worked with clients over a number of years based all around the world to try and understand what those are and trying to guide through the variables that I mentioned. You know, you've got location. I think in any commercial property, you need to be looking at the rentals, the condition of the premises, what the opportunity value is, what the sector is, the leasing profile, and there's countless others to sort of go through. But you know what? Whilst there's always exceptions in the marketplace, and let's take out the last couple of months of COVID to a certain degree, and I'll come on to that in a minute. The commercial property market as a whole has performed incredibly well over the last sort of 5+ years. What's caused that? I think you've all probably seen the well-documented and historic low interest rate environment, and I know Sue will probably come onto that a bit later. That has no doubt in my mind has driven a lot of people to focus on commercial property with the rates being low. But also on the back of that, we've seen a significant sort of lack of supply for one reason or another. So you combine, you know, low interest rate environment with a lack of supply, you have that classic supply and demand scenario, which has caused the commercial market to perform really well. You break that down into those three core sectors: your retail, your office, and your industrial. They have all performed differently over the last 5 years. Probably top performing, and you know, from a personal perspective, my personal sort of preference on industrial buildings, because it's my background, has performed probably the strongest. We've seen historic low vacancy rates across Auckland and across New Zealand, but at Auckland, industrial vacancy rates has been below 1% for some time. Offices has been slightly different, but still historic low vacancy rates, probably under 3 or 4% across Auckland, but there are significantly more offices. And again, within the office market, you have to then break it down again to different types of offices, whether it's premium grade in the city centre or A grade or different types of stock. And then retail, which is, in my view, probably the most fickle of all the sectors. It's the one sector that really craves location and it craves football. And we have seen the yields and the returns on retail really plummet, given generally those locations are your sort of high footfall, highly visible sort of locations. So COVID, what has that done over the last few months? It's still very early days. New Zealand has, as we were just talking about, performed so far quite well. Sorry, I should say we now. I'm a Kiwi, despite my British accent. We have performed well, and I think we're putting ourselves in a good, strong position going forward, notwithstanding, the few people that are trying to break out of confinement. Has it affected the property market? Yes. But what I've seen so far in commercial and the residential sense is an enormous resilience in not only the occupier market, but also from a purchasing perspective for people still to look at acquisitions at this time. In any marketplace, you have to consider any investment in the good times and the bad. And generally what we see in times of uncertainty is people kind of focus more towards more stable assets and property. There's nothing quite like the bricks and mortar value that you get in property, whereas in the share markets and equities, you see that enormous fluctuation. Whereas commercial property certainly is that safe haven in many people's minds. Yes, we'll see ups and we'll see downs, but over that long period, property generally performs very well. So I think we have seen, during that lockdown period, I had a lot of clients talk to me around, are we going to see yields increase, values go down? Is there opportunity out of it? Could we be swooping in if I've got an ability to, and try and pick up maybe a distressed asset? So far, yes, there may be some exceptions. So far, we haven't seen that. The advice that I've been looking at from valuers and such like is still very much steady as she goes. So maybe from a purely acquisition point of view, that's not what we want to hear. We all want to be trying to see the deal, maximize our return. But on the flip side, we want to see security in that investment. So I kind of take that as a positive. The commercial property investment is a two-way street in my head. You've got the analysis of the property, which is paramount. Understanding the building and the layouts and the rentals and the analysis of the lease and the funding and the tax position and all of that is critical. But what goes alongside that is your tenant, because without that tenant, the investment doesn't necessarily work. So really a big focus at the moment on the back of COVID is how are tenants faring. There's no doubt that a lot of our clients, a lot of landlords have been doing it tough as well to support their tenant. But without that tenant, the investment doesn't work. There's got to be a two-way sort of street in this relationship, because without the tenant being there paying the rental, it doesn't matter how good the investment is. There's no rental income. There's no return. So it's going to be interesting in the next few months as we come off or as businesses come off the government subsidy schemes, and I think we're in for some sort of choppy waters. How that might very well look is really a crystal balling. Unfortunately, I'd love to have the answer to that. I'm sure we all would. But at this point in time, yes, we have seen a number of occupiers disappear, and we've seen a number of occupiers reduce their employee numbers, unfortunately. But at the flip side, you see a lot of businesses, battle on through with that true Kiwi spirit of trying to make the best of a situation and seize opportunity out of it. So at this point, as I say, not a lot of change in the market. Over the last sort of few years, we have seen yields, which is your return against purchase price, not taking into account tax and everything else, definitely firm up and get lower and lower and lower. When I first moved to New Zealand and was buying property for people, we were seeing yields 7, 8, 9, maybe even 10%. Now we're looking at 4, 5%, maybe close to a 6% return. That's not to say things aren't available that are higher returns, but that return is always balanced by risk. You know, a higher yield may look good on the face of it, but it may be it may be associated with a higher degree of risk, which could be a long-term vacancy. You know, it's all well and good I'm looking at a building for a client at the moment, which is a 9% return, which looks great, but there's some definite vacancy risks that go with it, and we're assessing, is that risk worth it? Are we better off going to buy something with a more traditional length lease at 5% and reducing that risk profile? But there isn't any one size, as I said, one size fits all sort of position for anyone. You know, everyone's position is different. You know, I kind of take quite a personal approach to this, and I really generally ask myself sort of two very simple questions at the very beginning of it. And they're really quite basic. And number one is, and as I said, bearing in mind this is a two-way street. If you're left with an empty building, what are you left with? You know, there's no point having a 9% returning building and you're left with a huge vacancy, because that 9% becomes zero very quickly. But if you've got a 5%, you buy something at say a 5% return, which is sharper, don't get me wrong, but you're looking at it and you go, well, the rent is on the low side. I can see growth in the rental. I'm in an area of low vacancy rates. The unit or the building is of a flexible nature. Every time you look at all those and a number of other areas, you're reducing that risk. So to me, personally, certainly if it's a first commercial acquisition or early days acquisitions, it's something that is probably quite vanilla and quite boring and flexible to become that cornerstone investment for anyone. So the first question is, how easy will it release? What am I left with? What is the bricks and mortar value to me or to any other occupier? And the second question is quite simple from a personal perspective, is if it was my money when I'm talking to a client, would I buy it? You know, I have to generally sit home and go, I recommended this building to a client, would I buy it? You know, everything thereafter is just a process, an unemotional business discussion and a business decision. And that's what's quite different from the residential market. Certainly here in New Zealand, you know, the agents have, as you all know, Sue, have really vultured in on the auction process because it plays on the emotion of the house you want to live in. Whereas the commercial market, it should very much be unemotional. And if you get to the D-Day of going unconditional, you should be able to go, you know what, if I don't get it, I'll be disappointed because I've invested time and money into it, but it's got to be that pure business decision. From there, the journey with a commercial property is exactly that. It's a journey. You know, if you're starting out and it's a first acquisition, the aim should always be to look to improve and add to a portfolio over time. But as always, that first property is the hardest one. But it shouldn't necessarily be unattainable. The process behind it is relatively straightforward for anyone these days. Yes, there's specific advice that you'd have to take, and we could help with it at a time around tax, legal advice. Certainly a big one at the moment is sort of overseas investment office advice as well. And that all comes down to the personal position. I don't think there's anything else for me, really. I hope that's of use, of benefit, gives a little bit of an understanding. There's probably lots of things I've forgotten to say, and I'll probably kick myself as I leave. But yeah, unless there's any specific questions of anything I said. Yeah, it's a good point. And that's part of the sort of due diligence. And generally, so maybe to give an overview of how we'd go about, I would go about buying a property would be, you'd really want to try and buy something under a position where you've got a conditional contract in place. So you have that time to fully assess the building and go through the process of quantifying, doing that analysis, which is so important. You know, again, there's no one size fits all. I'd say a general process would be at point of contracting. You'd obviously you'd look to take some legal advice around the lease position and the title. As one report, the second one would be evaluation advice, which you'd probably need for any bank funding. Some tax advice, you know, given certainly from your guys' point of view, where you're based. That's important, and that would flow into whether a company setup was required. Generally, for our clients, we have always gone down that route of a company setup. The tax position is similar, whether it's a company tax or whether it's your personal rates. Earthquake strengthening is an interesting one. Depending on where you're buying, the banks will require it more. If you're buying in Christchurch, and they'll have a higher bar. But here, ironically, if you're buying here in Auckland, they're still pretty hot on it actually, but are less, and Sue probably touched upon this a bit, are less sort of pedantic about it. But again, it comes down to the age of the building. If you're looking at buying a building on sort of K Road with ground floor retail with a big veranda out the front and 2 stories of offices upstairs that are built, you know, 40, 50 years ago, they're going to be really, really hot on needing an IEP done, and I'd definitely recommend it. If you're buying a 2-year-old building, it's probably less of a requirement for the bank, or for your own due diligence, although I'm sure the lawyers would always say get one done. Outside of that, there may be some specific advice around planning, depending on the opportunity. If there's a development angle, then yes, would take some planning advice around what that may look like. But generally, you know, the commercial properties that we sort of do, by and large, it's that long-term passive investment to give the owners sort of a future income stream and or some real strong capital gain at the very end. I guess it comes down to, and this is where you step back from it and go, what are you trying to achieve? You know, yes, there's no doubt the return on investment, your purchase price will be stronger in those areas, but it comes back to asking yourself the question, what are you left with? You know, I've got a client of mine that they ran a cold store business in Invercargill for a number of years, and great as Invercargill goes for a cold store business in a cracking location, right next to the railway lines, had all this infrastructure into the property, and they bought it, they ran the business moved on, and now it's sat there vacant for probably 18 months, 2 years, because there isn't necessarily the market for that type of property in Invercargill, as an example. So it really comes down to the building, where it is, what the tenancy profile is, who the tenant is, and your appetite for risk. Because I would say certainly in the more regional locations, if your tenant vacates, then this is a very broad statement, you're probably more likely to see a greater degree of vacancy. That's not to say you won't see vacancy in Christchurch, Wellington, or Auckland. But then on the flip side, there's no doubting your return on investment will be greater. What's the key locations? I've been looking at quite a couple of things recently in Hamilton, because we're seeing some strong growth there. You know, infrastructure is, as you guys will know, is a big driver for property growth. The fact that you can now drive from Auckland to Hamilton in an hour or 10 minutes, motorway the whole way through, has seen huge growth there. You've seen huge residential growth in the surrounds in Cambridge. I've had a look at a number of properties, sort of Tauranga, but there isn't a great yield differential. You're seeing that there's a lot of old money that holds property there, a lot of farmers hold property there, and anything that comes to the market tends to be maybe, you know, subprime, people with things with risk, and then the risk isn't warranted over the yield, because you could actually probably get a similar return on your money for something here in Auckland. So you have to ask yourself the question, would you prefer to be in Auckland or Tauranga? And you might go, well, I prefer Tauranga because it's a nicer city, but in, you know, more difficult market conditions, Auckland may be more beneficial because obviously it's the country's biggest city. We've bought a number of buildings in Christchurch over the years. We have divested out quite a lot post the earthquake. Not because of any particular reason other than a simplification of clients' portfolios. You know, there was a lot of changes in the commercial landscape with post the earthquakes, and the need for earthquake strengthened buildings. I'm not saying you should shy away from it, because in any property acquisition, you've got to go into it with your eyes wide open. You've always got to expect at some point in the ownership, we're going to need to have some capital expenditure on the building, whether that be the roof or whatever. But as I say, the earthquake question is something to quantify at the time of any particular building. But they go hand in hand. They go hand in hand. Like I'd love to. I had a look at a building, a courier company building in Palmerston North, because I kind of looked at it and went strategically from a courier business. You see the spine of New Zealand down the North Island, and Palmy is in that line when you go from, you go from Auckland to Hamilton to Palmerston North to Wellington. It's that obvious line. And then I had another look one in Napier because it had that east-west connection. But if it was in a really regional little town somewhere, I'd probably be less likely to go for it. But it all comes to that weighing up those variables at the time. That's an interesting one. Long term, it's quite a divisive topic here at the moment. The ports in Auckland, over where else, yes, there's ports in Tauranga, and you've got the and Whangarei being the most local ones, outside of sort of Hamilton as being a land port. From a personal perspective, it makes a lot of sense for me, from a high level, to be out of Auckland. To be up in Whangarei. The obvious growth in Northland as a whole would be phenomenal. We've seen, and I think there must be some thought process for heading that way, because there's been massive infrastructure investment with the motorway going north. You've got at the moment being built a dual carriageway that's going to lead you around to Warkworth, which is was an hour or so north of Auckland. Now it's 20 minutes north. There's land being actively bought further north you go. Whether the port will shift there ultimately, I'd like to see it. Will it happen? I'm not quite so sure, because I'm not sure whether Whangarei has the long-term ability to handle the growth that they're expecting here in New Zealand. No, it hasn't, like Auckland hasn't. I think it's probably more likely end up going to go Tauranga personally, but I'd like to see it go north because of that opportunity for Northland. But you haven't seen anything specific yet? No. Too early. I'd say very broadly, yes. Infrastructure, communication drives a lot of this. Access, good access properties, like good location properties, will generally always perform well. Slight caveat to that might be, generally around there, you're seeing a lot of older properties, older in a New Zealand sense. Do they need sort of more maintenance and some capex spend on them? Maybe, but I'd be pretty positive about the long-term view. It may be some short-term pain with tenant mix, because you might find tenants vacating because, I think it's Albert Street at the moment in Auckland, there's chaos because of it, and all the tenants are kind of screaming because not only have they been through COVID, but they've had the road in front of them shut for the last year, 2 years. But on the flip side, when they come out the other end, they're going to be, right on the coalface of a huge footfall, which is going to be beneficial. So I'd say, yeah. Definitely seen that relaxation of car parkers. You said, Mark, Kiwis are generally car hungry. I did a redevelopment of a commercial property next door to me here, our building here, and they were super hot on car parking. And I was involved with another one in town, and it had a residential element, and the planning advice was almost zero car parks were needed because of where it was, which was good, because actually car parks cost you more money. They don't actually earn you anything from an investment perspective. You want built floor space to rent or to sell or whatever it might be, whereas car parks are just amenity values. Commercial might be viewed slightly differently to residential, especially if you're buying it via a different company vehicle. That sometimes throws a bit of a curly one to the banks. But that's, like Sue said, having the documentation, having the plan in place to make the application beforehand, so they know day one you're doing it through a limited company that may be owned in trust in behind, but you just bring all that out up front. And case by case. But I'd be 99.9% of our clients, as I sit here today, will have their properties would be owned by a company. You'd be a director, and probably, depending on the situation, that you'd have a trust in behind that would own the other 99% of the shares. And that's a benefit here in New Zealand. The trust. Again, I'm not a tax advisor, so I'd say that take this with a grain of salt, and you don't all need your own tax advice. But the tax position via a trust here is quite beneficial with the lack of any gift tax there may be, so you can gift money to your trust without any tax implications. But yeah, it's definitely the way to go. Or any major sort of change of capital gains, any capital gains tax, because yeah, it would be political suicide in New Zealand for it to be brought up. But Labor did say they would. Personally, I'm in favour of a capital gains tax. I know that sounds strange, but I think maybe being in the UK where you're taxed when you buy a property and you're taxed when you sell one, I'm used to it. But I think actually there's an argument for it to be beneficial to the wider economy and the wider marketplace, especially when you've certainly seen, as Sue touched upon here in Auckland especially, huge growth of properties values and people flicking day to day. You know, you've seen some horror stories of people buying residential mainly, selling it 2 days later for hundreds of thousands of dollars profit because they've just seized an opportunity. And, you know, fortune favours the brave, but there's a huge revenue that could support, you know, other areas. So I'm maybe being a bit liberal about it, but I'm generally in favour of a capital gains tax. Yeah, potentially. I think with the impact of COVID, I think that has been re-looked at. I don't know if you're overseas based. I know certainly, as I said, I've just gone through a property acquisition myself, a commercial one, and that was the advice that I had, that I could use any, if it was negatively geared, any losses carried forward against personal income. It might be different if I'm based here and you reside here. I don't know how that might be perceived if you're based overseas and having a negatively geared asset here, but it's worth the discussion with the accountant, because yeah, that can be that's a very tried and tested way of you know, tax management. Yeah, I'll have to. Yeah, we like most of our clients are based all around the world, a lot in sort of your neck of the woods, and yeah, the accountants we've used have given them that advice. You would be taxed here, you know, as company tax. Whether there's a double taxation agreement, I don't know, and whether you're taxed on it sort of if you're residing in Dubai, I'm not quite sure. So yeah, 100% on that mark. Yeah. On residential, commercial, you'd be probably typically less because the quantums of rentals are that much greater. Something between anything between 4 to 6% of net or gross rental. It just depends on the rent roll and the complexities of a particular portfolio or even building. You know. Well, here's a word for you. The new normal, I guess, it's a big word being said here, I'm sure, around the world. It will depend on the property. You know, if it's 1950s, three-story building with unreinforced masonry, then I think insurance and bank funding will be phenomenally difficult without a plan to upgrade the building. If, however, it's a 2-year-old building, you know, steel portal frame, then very, very easy. So it will depend on the particular building. Opportunity out of buildings like that, though, if you go into it with the eyes wide open on a commercial and a residential sense. My wife and I bought a house 3 or 4 years ago. It went to auction. It didn't sell because it had an outstanding code of compliance from 3 or 4 years ago. The market was kind of looking. It was in 2017, so election year, and the market was taking a bit of a breather. And you know, my wife being a risk-averse lawyer didn't necessarily see the opportunity, but me being sort of the way I am, did see it, and we contracted it, and we were able to work through that process under a due diligence. And in the end, it was all good. But that was the opportunity we could see. But if it's like from an insurance point of view, it's very different. So go into it with your eyes wide open. Do the due diligence, understand risk. Always understand the risk, because it could be a benefit, but it may not be. There's two strands to it there, because you've seen as of late there's a lot of well-documented sort of press around leasehold apartments, and I think you'll see probably a glut of those coming to the market. There probably will be quite a few mortgagee sales there's already, but what you have seen is there are a number of significant residential apartment blocks being built due for completion soon in the centre of town. We are seeing a shift here in Auckland, especially and a drive for first-time buyers, realising maybe it's that mind shift of the Kiwi sort of mentality. Gone are the days of the quarter-acre dream. You know, friends of mine are saying, "Oh, I'm being told my first house should be my forever home." But, you know, gradually that mind shift is switching to, well, you know, maybe my fourth or fifth house is my forever home. The first one is just get you on the ladder. And a lot of first-time buyers are, you know, flooding towards, you know what, I don't, like we said, I don't need a car park. Actually living in the centre of town where I've got, you know, I can still go out to Mission Bay, I can still go to Ponsonby really close to the beaches or whatever, but I'm in the centre of town because I work on Shortland Street. It's a 5-minute walk. Why wouldn't I make my life easy? You know, we've seen a lot of those sold for that reason. Whether, you know, through COVID and now the impact of that, whether that changes, as Sue said, it's probably too early to tell. But certainly you look at Auckland from a top 10 livable city in the world point of view, who wouldn't want to live on an apartment block? If you could get your head around living in an apartment and you're open to that idea, you know, certainly from a city perspective, with everything that's got in the future coming, you know, with America's Cup and all the development and all of that. And I can see there's still been continued big demand for apartments for people that want it as a bolt hole. You know, people like yourselves that maybe still living overseas. I know a lot of our airline pilot clients, whether it be flying for Emirates or Cathay, whoever, have always looked at apartments for that reason. You know, let's keep a little apartment in Auckland, so when I'm in town or when I want to come back on holiday, I've got myself on the ladder still. I can be in the centre of town. I can head off. So I think probably it will fluctuate, but it'll probably be okay in the end. It's the same in commercial. You know, on the smaller properties, you'll probably have a higher turnover of tenancies. You'll never get long-term tenants. You know, on a little office or a little industrial building, you'll get a 3 or 4 year lease. You're never going to get a 6 or 7 year lease. But generally, even with a higher turnover, you're going to have probably more. There's a bigger pool of people that would rent it. You know, so yes, a higher turnover, but a higher re-tenanting rate. You know, certainly on industrial, we've seen, like Sue said, then almost back-to-back daily on industrial buildings over the last few years. Have to, you know, work through a building or property or anything, you know, commercial or residential, and look at those pros and cons and see the opportunities. That's probably the fun part of sort of a property investment, is that, in my mind, that analysis and that what is the deal, that thrill of the chase. You know, then you make it work or it doesn't work afterwards.